Due to the themes of this podcast, listener discretion is advised. Lock your doors, close the blinds, change your passwords. This is Secrets and Spies. Secrets and Spies is a podcast that dives into the world of espionage, terrorism, geopolitics, and intrigue. This podcast is produced and hosted by Chris Carr.
On today's podcast, I'm joined by David Neiwert. David is an investigative journalist and author who focuses on the far right. On this episode, we talk about what authoritarianism is. We look at the implications of the Jan 6 pardons. We look at the potential for more political violence, and David shares his own experiences about reporting on the far right. So it's a packed episode, and I hope you find it informative. Thank you for listening. Take care.
The opinions expressed by guests on Secrets and Spies do not necessarily represent those of the producers and sponsors of this podcast.
David, welcome back to the podcast. I was trying to remember exactly when it was you were last on, and I think it may have been 2021. It's been a while.
Yeah. It was. I think it was after January 6th. But
which is slightly ironic, but yeah.
Yeah, it seems like forever ago. But yeah, a lot of things change in a lot of hurry these days.
So true. Well, David, for the benefit of listeners who may not have heard our previous interviews, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your sort of expertise on the far right?
Sure. Well, I'm a fourth generation Idahoan and grew up there, and had my early experience in the 70s and 80s dealing with neo-Nazis in the Idaho Panhandle, and I started reporting on right-wing extremists as a dedicated beat in the 90s when I started writing about militia groups, and so I've stayed on that subject pretty steadily since the 90s, and it's at the time I started doing it, it was because I thought, well, this is a beat that will provide me with a pretty steady diet of stories that, because my experience with right-wing extremists is that they always create dysfunction, they create crime, they create all kinds of, they destroy families, they destroy communities, and that sort of thing, and it's the kind of thing that creates news stories. And so I did it more or less from a journalistic self-interest thing, but over time, of course, I also realized that standing up to and dealing with right-wing extremists is really important for us as a society, because these people create a lot of harm, and I've especially developed a lot of compassion for the people who are their victims. And ultimately, I even developed some compassion for some of the extremists themselves, mainly because so many of them become victims of this ideology themselves. It ruins their lives. It ruins, destroys their families and their communities too. And that's because, they're gullible enough to fall down the hole, fall down these rabbit holes.
Yeah, indeed. Well, today we're going to be talking about, obviously the far right, but I wanted to sort of start a little bit from the kind of beginning and talk about authoritarianism. And I wanted to ask you a very big question. What is authoritarianism, and what do you think draws people to it?
Well, we think of authoritarianism in terms of the systems that it creates, and typically we put it in, cast it as a function of the leaders, the authoritarian leaders, Mussolinis and the Hitlers, and as well as in our modern times, the Putins and people like that. Um, but really, authoritarianism is a phenomenon that involves, the public, because it's actually it has personality type. There's a personality trait. The people, authoritarian personalities are, people who are drawn to this sort of dictatorial style of government because they believe that it solves issues, and the people who prefer authoritarian governments are people who want, their Alexanders to cut the Gordian knot in a single blow. They get annoyed with and actually disenchanted with democracy because it wrings its hands too much, and there's too much process and it's too slow. And so there are always there's always a certain amount of authoritarian personalities in every population. Typically, about 20% of every population has authoritarian personalities. But you can actually increase authoritarian response in the population and encourage people to become more authoritarian in their personalities by constant fear mongering. When you create an atmosphere rich with fear, people get into what I call an authoritarian crouch, where they just, want the government to keep them safe, and they don't care how they do it. And so, it's authoritarian personality types have three basic, what we call behavioral and attitudinal clusters. The first one is authoritarian submission, which is, the submission to the rule of the glorious leader, or to whom they defer, all thought and and process, all the other sort of governmental processes. Um, Second is authoritarian aggression, which is aggression directed against anyone who fails to submit. Um, and then finally, there's conventionalism, the idea that the authoritarians represent the true national personality. That is, in our case, the real Americans, and of course, in your case, the true Brits.
Yes, you hear these phrases a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we get them all the time too. The real Americans, and it's pretty. So anyway, those three in combination, those three behavioral traits, really combine to create a whole long list of things that are um, dealing, that have to do with how they treat others, and uh, they are highly paranoid. They succumb readily to conspiracism, um, and they have all kinds of, it's all these things that we've kind of come roaring out since
Mm.
2016 in American politics. And yeah, and there's definitely a violent undercurrent to it, and that violence really manifested itself on January 6th, 2021.
Yeah. Some people view Donald Trump and the MAGA movement as simply just another expression of partisan politics, and they often dismiss concerns about authoritarianism or white supremacy and kind of say that those concerns are overblown. However, many argue that the MAGA movement represents something beyond traditional political divisions. Can you explain kind of what the MAGA movement is and sort of how it developed?
Well, it's essentially, I mean, the MAGA movement I just think of as being the authoritarian followers who make up the Donald Trump's following. But they're the people who make it work. They're the people who put him in power and then and then basically threatened the rest of us with violence if we dared to stand up to him and disagree. Um, but yeah, I would say that they're, um, it obviously developed as a response to Donald Trump's presidency and his political style. Um, but it is a movement that believes that it represents the real America, that, you know, the they're, that they're going to, uh, basically eliminate the people who are dragging the
Mm,
country down. And so it has this very powerful eliminationist component, where they want to either deport people altogether, or they want to lock them up in prison, or in the cases of, a lot of these, I spent a lot of time in these guys' online spaces, and they talk about killing people all the time. It's a pretty common theme for them to want to rub out their neighbors with the AR-15s that they sitting there stroking the
yeah,
triggers on,
yeah,
you know. Um, so um, And, the idea of "Make America Great Again" is actually classically fascist. One of my favorite scholars of fascism is a guy from, Oxford Brookes there in the UK, named Roger Griffin, and he wrote a book called "The Nature of Fascism," and the essential, I mean, he tried to come up with an essential definition of what fascism is, and his answer was that it's what he called palingenetic ultranationalism. And palingenesis is the idea of the phoenix-like rebirth of the nation, and it's with combined with this ultranationalist component. That's MAGA. MAGA is very much palingenetic in nature, and it's definitely ultranationalist. So, and ultimately, I would say that the product that we're seeing here and have been seeing on the streets in the United States for the last 7 years or so is fundamentally proto-fascist or neo-fascist.
yeah. So it is fair to say the MAGA movement is authoritarian in its nature.
Oh yeah, yeah, very authoritarian. Yeah, yeah. If you disagree with them, they will cut you down.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. So, what role do you think sort of online commentators and influencers on YouTube and social media have played in moving the MAGA movement from the fringes to the mainstream? And how do they tend to frame things?
Well, the way they do it is, of course, with this sort of uh, this information environment that's riddled with disinformation and conspiracism. Really false stories, and they use the media environment that they use is one that is wide open to all sorts of conspiracy theorists and people peddling smears and lies, and being able to do so with impunity. The people running the sort of MAGA media movement are, guys like uh, Tucker Carlson, who can sit there and spew all kinds of falsehoods, all kinds of crap on the air to millions of people and not have to pay a single consequence for it. Although he did obviously get eventually fired from Fox News because he helped cost
Mm,
them
yeah.
several $1 million, uh, hundreds of millions of dollars over the election results, because the Fox got sued by one of the companies that made the election counting machines uh, that Carlson had been sitting there slagging uh, relentlessly after the election, and claiming that the election results were false. And you know, there's fortunately there are still some uh, there's the ability to stand up to these lies in the courts, but it takes a really long time. And in the meantime, these guys, what's the old saying? a lie will get halfway around the world before the truth even has a chance to get its pants on. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely the sort of say the social media environment in the build up to the election was, alt right. I feel is the mainstream of social media now, and there's a lot of people who are either overtly pro Trump and MAGA, or they tend to be kind of somewhere sort of in the middle, but tend to in the last moments then go and endorse Donald Trump. Somebody like Joe Rogan, for example. And I find that what's interesting as well is that the MAGA movement seems to really be attracting men, young men. Well, it seems to be men from their 20s to their mid 40s. Because I know some people. I'm in my 40s, and I know a few people of my generation who have, over the years, because they've tried to be entrepreneurs, etc., and followed all sorts of things on YouTube, have slowly become much more not overtly MAGA supporters, but they're very sympathetic to it and tend to think that Donald Trump's going to do a good job, and that they're the people who tend to dismiss concerns or say that we're being reactionary. So I just find it really interesting in that it seems to always appeal to mainly men. I don't know if you have any sort of observations on that.
well, for one thing, it's a profoundly misogynistic movement. It's not a surprise that there are fewer women who are attracted to this sort of stuff, because they're constantly putting women down. I mean, really a core of the appeal, this whole the attack on diversity, equity, and inclusion is a classic example of this, because, of course, DEI, the primary beneficiaries of DEI measures are women. It opens up spaces for women to be able to be included. Um, and so yeah, there's really a lot to it. This um, ultimately, I would say, I mean, uh, the thing that I think turns most women off is its utter lack of empathy, its utter lack of compassion for other people, because I think women tend to be more empathetic and more compassionate. And um, and so, when you have a movement that's very much in your face, not just non-compassionate, but anti-compassionate, anti-empathetic, um, then I think a lot of people, and of course, empathetic men like myself, kind of go, really, what are you doing here? You know, uh, but unfortunately, there's a lot of men who get raised nowadays to think that masculinity entails shedding your empathy, shedding your ability to put yourself in other people's shoes. That being masculine is all about just being a spoiled brat. I'm going to do what I want, type stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
It's really toxic,
Indeed, indeed. And what's interesting as well, a lot of these alt-right commentators talk about there's a crisis in masculinity.
right?
And I agree with them. I think there is a crisis in masculinity, but I don't think it's the same crisis they're talking about.
Well, yeah, yeah. There is a crisis because there's so many men who are getting taught that to be a man, you have to shed all this stuff. I got raised with a very different model of masculinity. I don't know about you, but uh, my granddad was probably my model of masculinity, and he was, he didn't have any more than a sixth grade education, but he led this road construction company in southern Idaho that built most of the roads in Idaho, and um, was, a beloved man when he passed away. And he took care of people and looked after people, and he was careful. He was really cautious about how he judged people. He tried to deal with people in an even-handed way, and in a way that was not harsh. And um, it was just a. I mean, that was how I always was raised to be a man. That basically a man, the way I was raised, is a man who's big, a person who's big inside, and he's so big enough that he's not threatened by having to show weakness or show compassion or show caring. Those things don't make you smaller, they make you bigger. But little men, little mean men who have no compassion will teach you that, oh no, those things make you less masculine. That's the old John Wayne stuff. And, my granddad thought John Wayne was a small man. So, because he was mean spirited. And, I tend to, I was raised the same way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that there's a lot of there is a problem with masculinity now, and that people are getting really a very perverse idea of what it means to be a man these days, and I don't think that women and feminism are responsible for that. I think men are.
Yeah, I agree with you. Talk about where you were raised and stuff. I was just thinking about my childhood whilst you were talking about yours there. And when I was a kid, sort of my heroes are people like Captain James T. Kirk or Captain Picard of Star Trek. So I'm not quite sure what that effect that had on me,
Sure.
but
What wise people. But well, you appreciate wisdom. You're able to slow down and stop and listen to other people. Um, the model of masculinity that today's young men are getting is this model that comes out of the wrestling world.
yeah, yeah,
That's
that's so true.
that's not and that's not real masculinity as far as I'm concerned. So
No, no, I agree. Well, just before we move to a break, do you? My other question was: do you think then? I'm always fascinated by sort of Donald Trump. Do you think Donald Trump is an opportunist levering the MAGA movement for his own gain, or do you think he genuinely believes in the ideology it represents? Because he's been a bit of a political flip-flopper through his career.
yeah, no, I think he's total opportunist. I don't know how much he actually believes this stuff. I think what he is profoundly ignorant. I think he's like a spoiled brat who was raised as who was incredibly spoiled as a child and never had to think anything through for himself, and expects the whole world to come to him, and has been
Yeah,
that way all of his life. So I mean, he's profoundly ignorant. I mean, the stuff that he says, like about whales and and windmills, just makes me laugh, right? Because it's so deeply ignorant. Or his discussion of the California fires was so ignorant, it was
yeah,
ludicrous. When he talks about immigration, and he starts bringing up Hannibal Lecter,
mm,
and the reason he does is because um, he has confused asylum seekers, people who are coming, the people who have been creating the crisis in American immigration the last 4 years or so, are the people who are flooding to the borders and seeking asylum, right? And so he assumes that those people are coming from insane asylums, and he calls them Hannibal Lecters. This is why he brings up Hannibal Lecter in the context of talking about immigration. And it has, people are really confused by this, but you got to understand, he is so ignorant that he thinks that people seeking asylum are people who are coming from asylums, right? I mean,
mm,
his
mm,
levels of ignorance are just astonishing. And it's because he's never had to actually learn anything himself in his own life. He's always assumed that whatever he sort of got stuffed in his brain when he was 5 years old is the truth that he still adheres to now. And he's never he doesn't read, he doesn't learn anything new, he doesn't take any time to actually learn anything. He just and this feeds his ignorance. So yeah, I think he's a really deeply, profoundly ignorant man. And on top of that, yeah, he's a pathological liar and has zero empathy for other human beings. They don't get much worse than that. certainly in the political realm.
Mm. Well, this is it. One would hope a president or someone who becomes president would at least have a high degree of empathy, because it's a role that's about governing people and the nation. It surely should be the
Right,
big
right.
part of it. But yeah,
Yeah, and he's the
yeah,
opposite.
yeah, indeed.
He is the opposite. He has zero empathy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. So, David, can you talk to us about January the 6th? Because I feel that this is sort of going to become I think Trump would like it to be a bit like Tiananmen Square, in the sense of that it just disappears. So I think, for the record, it would be good just to chat about what actually happened on January the 6th from sort of your understanding and expertise.
Sure. Well, yeah, in fact, as you can see, I actually did a whole book on January 6th that I used to, and I really, I looked into, I mean, what happened on January 6th was really a culmination of the previous 4 years, and particularly the kind of street politics that Trump had engendered. And in particular, the rise of groups like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and these other white nationalists, as well as all the Christian nationalists who are out there marching in the streets um, with Trump. And they were basically, it's a fanatical following, fanatical MAGA following, who truly believed that that the election was stolen from Trump. And they, you know, he called them all to the Capitol. I believe Trump knew that was building up this army of violent actors who would take violence to the street, had been doing it for some time. Um, when I remember, for instance, we had one of the marchers in Portland, a guy named Aaron Danielson, was out and marching with these thugs and attacking people on the streets of Portland. And one of the people they were stalking turned the tables on him, and he pulled a gun out and shot Danielson and killed him. And that anti-fascist he went on the run for exactly 2 days. Trump basically sent out the U.S. Marshals, and he made it clear that they weren't to arrest him; they were just to summarily execute him, and they did. They found him at in a suburb of Olympia, and and just gunned him down. And and that was a real sign, and that was in 2020, of course, that happened. So that was a real sign of where this thing was going to me, was that the Proud Boys were out there to enforce, Trump's edicts and Trump's politics. And if anybody stood up to them, and particularly if they stood up to them with lethal force, they would be gunned down. They would be dealt with in the harshest measures possible. And that is very much, what happened. And about a month later, Trump, during his debate with Biden, told the Proud Boys to stand by and be ready, basically. And that had a real ominous sound to me, because I knew that if he lost the election, he was going to be likely to try to get this mob out in the street to defend him in Washington. And we saw two sort of warm-up gatherings in Washington after the election, one on November 14th and another one on December 12th, that drew large crowd of MAGA followers, and particularly Proud Boys, who attacked an African American church and burned their banners and committed hate crimes. And it was about a week after that that Trump sent out a tweet telling everybody that they were going to be having a big Stop the Steals rally on January 6th, and for everybody to be there will be wild. And this was the green light. And all these groups, all of these uh, fanatical MAGA followers started making plans to show up in Washington, D.C. on the 6th and to try to prevent Trump from being forced out of office.
Mm.
And that was part of his plan. Now, mind you, what was also clear, what we also know from his machinations inside the White House and with members of Congress, is that it was part of what we call an inside-outside game. He was going to be pressuring Congress from inside by having members of the Republican Party stand up and do the tactics to try to delay the count and try to, do all these things to do it while he gathered the forces from the outside to provide real pressure of real violence to pressure Congress from the outside. And fortunately, Congress did not succumb to that game, but it was we came very, very, very close to this mob succeeding. They very nearly caught Mike Pence. They very nearly caught several senators. They had very nearly caught, the scene where, the martyr, the woman who was shot, actually, uh, that moment when she was shot was right when there were still people on the floor of the house trying to get out of the chambers and get to a safe place. And the mob was sitting there on the other side of the glass, and they could see the members of Congress trying to flee. And they went crazy because that mob wanted to get at those members of Congress. And that's when they started pounding on the glass and then broke it. And when I actually jumped up into the window pane is when she was shot. But she was trying to lead the mob to go attack fleeing members of Congress. And if that had happened, if there had been people caught by the mob and lynched, and they would have been lynched, or at least beaten to death. Um, whatever form of lynching you want to call it. It would have been, I don't think that there would have been a vote that day or later that night as it happened. So all of these things, Mitt Romney almost walked right into the arms of the mob. Unfortunately, was prevented from doing so by one of the security officers. We had so many close calls that day, and we were just very fortunate that people did the right thing and were able to get into a safe space and prevent the mob from killing anyone or harming anyone, and then being able to finally clear them out and then hold the vote later that night. I think that was really key. But if that hadn't happened, I think that there's a very good chance that Trump and his plan would have succeeded.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, it would have been a coup. I mean, it was obviously he was attempting a coup then, and now he's pulled it off. 2024 means the coup has succeeded. Um, and he did it with an ostensibly legitimate election. I am not by any means persuaded that election result was actually legitimate. Um, especially considering the behavior we're watching now. These are clearly men who have zero respect for democracy or its processes. If they had figured out a way to hack the electoral results, I have zero doubt that they would have. And I think it's there are a lot of reasons to suspect that that they may have actually gotten an illegitimate result and installed Trump in office as a result of it. But even without that, even if he had actually legitimately won, we still have a constitution, and he's still breaking it every day that he's been in office.
Yeah.
He's still violating the Constitution constantly, and we have no means of holding him accountable yet. But I think that eventually there will be.
Yeah. I hope so. Yeah. I'm just shocked that he was allowed to get away with his sort of actions on
Yeah.
January the 6th, and I don't know. I'm still trying to get my head around why it took so long to bring him to account, and then how anybody allowed it to all sort of fall apart the way it did, and now he's back in power. I just don't quite understand how that was even possible, but that's maybe for a legal podcast. But
Well, I think it's that the Republican Party became an authoritarian party, and is filled with authoritarian personalities, people who back Trump to the hilt no matter what.
Mm,
And 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 even if there are people who wanted to, maybe Republicans who maybe had doubts about it and wanted to stand up to it, they had all the spines God gave a jellyfish, and were easily pushed around and easily cowed. I think Mitch McConnell, the day after January 6th, wanted to put Donald Trump in prison, and definitely would have been. I think he would have been good with an impeachment. But in the week after January 6th, Trump was able to rustle up all the authoritarian threats that he could, because he made it clear that he was going to destroy the Republican Party and take the Republican Party down with him if they didn't back him to the hill. He was going to go start a new party called the Patriot Party, which would have definitely destroyed the Republican Party
mm,
if he had done so. And so that was the threat he held over all these mainstream Republicans, and they selfishly decided to give in to that blackmail.
yeah. So let's talk a bit about the pardons, because obviously now all the rioters, I believe, have all been pardoned and have been released from prison, and some who are in the sort of justice system awaiting trial, their cases have been cancelled. So can you talk to us about sort of why that's significant and important? Because it's truly shocking watching from afar.
Well, we've already seen several of these pardoned J6ers commit crimes as soon
Yeah,
as they get out.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, it's basically, what we're dealing with now is that Trump is has the ability to, he has these people who have already committed crimes on his behalf, and they now know that they can commit crimes on his behalf and get pardoned, that there's no consequences for committing crimes on Donald Trump's behalf, other than, well, they had to spend a couple of years in prison. But they've all been pardoned, and now they're national heroes, according to Trump.
mm,
Yeah, no, I think the public, especially the parts of the public that still believe in democratic processes, and might want to stand up to Trump and his rule. I think that they now, face the actual threat of real violence from these actors who've been freed from prison. Uh, there are a number of them who have been very clear that they would like to get retribution for what happened to them. I would say, that there's a lot of concern among a lot of us who oppose Trump and deal with this stuff, that he has unleashed this army of criminal brown shirts
mm,
who will do anything for him, and who knows what that'll mean. But combined with when I spend time in their online spaces and see how much violent talk goes on, see how eager they are to start shooting their neighbors and shooting their fellow Americans,
mm.
and rounding them, and then rounding up Latino people into concentration camps. Um, I think that there is just an incredible potential for a lot of really horrific violence over the next 4 years, if not longer.
One big question I was to ask you is about what are your thoughts on Trump's attempt to gut the FBI and Justice Department of anyone who's been associated with the January 6th Capitol attack? Because that's been a really interesting sort of development that's come up.
Well, it's obviously the same thing as his dismissal of the anybody in the FBI who was involved in investigating the Russiagate
Mm,
stuff, involved in investigating his ties to Russia. He did the same. He's dismissed those people even before he dismissed people involved in the January 6th investigations. And it's the same sort of concept that he wants anybody within federal law enforcement who might be able to hold him accountable for
mm,
committing these federal crimes to be gone. And he doesn't want anybody in federal law enforcement who might hold him accountable for future crimes. He wants it to be clear that he is going to rule with impunity, and anyone within the FBI who doesn't agree, who tries to hold him accountable for breaking the law,
mm,
for violating the Constitution, um, is going to face the same fate. So it serves multiple purposes. It A, gets rid of the elements that might threaten him with criminal prosecution, but it also sends a really powerful message to anybody still there that your career is going to be over as soon as you try to take action against him.
mm. Now, there have been concerns about sort of far-right infiltration of law enforcement, the military, and the intelligence services.
Mhm.
Do you feel those concerns are sort of justified, and do you think that will now potentially get worse?
Yes, yeah, I've written quite a bit about far right infiltration, both of ranks of law enforcement and in the military. It's been a problem since the 2000s.
Mm,
I mean, the FBI did an assessment back in 2006 that warned about letting white supremacists infiltrate the ranks of the military, because the military in particular um, is one of these is having military experience is a huge bonus if you want to get recruited by by right wing extremists, because they really look up to people with military experience for several reasons. One is that they're following rules and that sort of thing, but also they have experience with weapons and materiel. It's what we call the Timothy McVeigh effect. We always used to talk in the 90s before McVeigh came along about how, well, we were pretty lucky because we would see various right-wing extremists try different kinds of acts of domestic terrorism and not succeed because they weren't terribly competent at it. And then McVeigh came along, and here's a guy who actually was competent, had experience gained in the military, and knew how to create a massive truck bomb. And, he killed 168 people.
yeah.
So um, yeah, so, this is always a concern that going into the 2000s, that white supremacists and right-wing extremists would be recruiting people who would be capable of causing tremendous amounts of harm. And so that was always the concern with the military. And we saw really a very high percentage of people who were arrested on January 6th or for their behavior of January 6th who did have military backgrounds. It was one of the main threads that we saw connecting a lot of the people there. But then we also saw a lot of people in law enforcement, and Oath Keepers in particular were an organization that specifically recruited people in law enforcement and the military, and they went after a lot of uh, cops. I met a lot of cops when I was out covering these street events, these riots. I covered about 20 different Proud Boys events over the course of the 5 years I was out there. And the cops were always very sympathetic to the Proud Boys, always very sympathetic to the Oath Keepers. And a lot of it is because they themselves, in some cases, actually were members of the Oath Keepers. And then finally, there's a third component that are the sheriffs, county sheriffs. We've had since the late 90s, we've had these people organizing a movement. They call it the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association. And they went after specifically sheriffs to recruit them into this belief that the sheriff is the ultimate law of the land, that he's able to overrule federal laws within his own county, and that they are basically laws unto themselves. And it's CSPOA is the acronym, and they've been pretty successful in recruiting sheriffs in rural counties. And so we've got a lot of people who are mostly in rural counties who are these radical right-wing extremists who are running law enforcement there. And so, yeah, and those people are particularly concerned when it comes to um, rounding up immigrants. I think we're seeing them be very active on that front. So we have multiple fronts in law enforcement and military where these guys are really a problem, and will be a problem going forward.
Yeah, no, I bet.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. Now, because of these pardons, do you think we're now going to see an uptick in political violence, especially towards sort of minority groups and those who do not subscribe to the MAGA ideology?
Yeah, I think that there are a couple of components of American society that are going to be targeted by these guys. And uh, first on the list, obviously, is immigrants, because they're very eager to start rounding people up and sending them off to the concentration camp that they're building at Guantanamo.
Mm,
Um, and and yeah, they're that's absolutely first on their list, and they're already not being terribly particular about whether they pick up citizens or whether they pick up people who are actually undocumented or here illegally. And that's been the case in the past when America's done these sort of mass deportations. There was a mass deportation program done by Eisenhower back in the 50s called Operation Wetback, where they wound up swooping up close to 1 million people and deporting them. And there were a number of civil rights violations that occurred during all of that, and in particular, they swept up a lot of Americans. And of course, I have a fair amount of experience also with the Japanese American internment that occurred during World War II, um, where I wrote a book on that, and interviewed a lot of Japanese Americans who were in the internment camps. And one of the things that really was clear in all that was that, um, one of the reasons that Japanese American internment was a travesty was that um, uh, 70,000 of the 120,000 people that they put into these concentration camps were citizens, or children mostly. Uh, but some of them were teenagers and some of them were adults. Several of the guys that I interviewed served in the 442nd, which was the most decorated unit in World War II, all Japanese Americans. and they fought in Europe only, and they were sent into meat grinder situations because their lives were expendable. And so they wound up being the most decorated unit in the war. Um, but they were, and these guys were real American heroes. And I interviewed a few of them, and they were all, they were all adults at the time that
Mm.
the announcement, that everybody was sent off to the internment camps, and they were able to get out of the camps by joining the 442 and going off and fighting in Europe. And, and it is just really underscores what a travesty the whole thing was, because these were, really brave people who were willing to lay their lives down for the country, and for a country that was locking their parents up. Pretty remarkable, really. And anyway, and that's what we're doing again. I mean, we're the reason that the Supreme Court at the time in 1943 issued a ruling called the Korematsu versus United States case, uh, that basically upheld the internment and said it was legal. And that ruling is now considered one of the real black marks on the Supreme Court's history.
Mm. Mm.
And we're about to reproduce it again. Trump wants to eliminate birthright citizenship so that he can ship all these children back with their parents, even if they are citizens. He doesn't care if they're citizens. He wants the kids to go back with their parents too. And in a lot of cases, the parents are, we're talking about the abuelita who's been here for 30 years and running the taco shop on the corner. I mean, these are people who are contributing to the country and do a great job. And the crime that they're supposed to be committing is actually a misdemeanor, um, and usually results in a fine if you're caught. But now we have this idea that anyone who is here is undocumented is a criminal, and you'll hear them talk about criminals all the time, and yet. They're actually not criminals. They're people who committed a misdemeanor penalty, a civil misdemeanor. And, yeah, it's, you know, um, there's a lot of misconceptions about immigration and the status of undocumented workers in the United States, um, and their supposed levels of criminality. One of the things that's assumed is that if you're here undocumented, then you crossed the border illegally, right? But actually, around 65% of our current undocumented immigrants who are, number around 11 million, about 65% of them are actually visa overstays. People who came here legally, did the right thing, came through the right way, but then let their visas expire and just stayed after their visas expired. Which is, again, as I say, that's not a criminal act. That's a civil misdemeanor. Again, we're the hyperinflation of the kinds of criminality, and then finally, they do you know tie on to certain very tragic cases like the Laken Riley incident, where an undocumented immigrant murdered a young woman, uh, a guy who probably shouldn't have been in the country in the first place. Um, and, her family wanted paying for his presence by losing their daughter. But the problem is with all of that is that the actual levels of crime committed by undocumented immigrants is less than half of what a native-born American commits.
Mm.
It's a much lower undocumented immigrants commit crimes at much lower rates than native-born Americans do, and it's a lot of that has to do with the fact that you know, most of them undocumented. It's like, one of the things that they often get accused of is of voting illegally. That was one of the Trump liked to tell people that the reason he lost is that they had all these undocumented immigrants voting for him. Undocumented immigrants don't vote because they don't want to. It would be one of the best ways to get caught, for being and get crossways with the law. Most undocumented immigrants do not commit crimes because they don't want to get sent back to where they came from. Because the best way for that to happen is to get crossways with the law and have, a law officer put you in prison, and then they find out your status and then they send you back. Right. So generally speaking, the ethos in the undocumented community is very much, don't commit any crimes and just keep your head down, do the work, be a contributing member of the community and that sort of thing. And that's generally what we see. And of course, there are exceptions, and some of them are indeed very tragic. But to build a whole policy built around this real distortion of what's actually happening is tragic.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think there are now MAGA people who believe that if they commit an act of violence against someone, that they're going to get a presidential pardon because of what happened with the January 6th defendants?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm,
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, it hasn't played out yet. We've had a couple of them get arrested already,
mm,
doing things that kind of seem to suggest that they see themselves as being able to act with impunity, being invulnerable to the law. Um, I don't, we haven't seen a lot of that yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if we do.
mm, I don't, indeed, indeed. Well, I wanted to ask you another question as well about obviously, there's some commentators on the right who believe that Antifa is the real threat and the perpetrator of political violence in the US, and they like to
Right.
cite sort of riots and protests during Trump's first term as evidence of this. What are your thoughts on Antifa, and does it even exist?
Well, Antifa, or is it Antifa?
Yeah, I'm not
I mean,
sure actually. Is it I went for Antifa this time. Is or is it
yeah,
Antifa? Yeah.
yeah, nobody seems to have come up with the right pronunciation for it, but yeah, the pronunciation we get from right wings, the folks on the right, is Antifa.
Yeah.
Well, it exists as a movement, but it's a very tiny movement. It has very little influence in political circles. I mean, one of the things that we constantly heard from MAGA types is that this people identifying Democrats with
Mm.
Antifa, which was absolute bollocks. There was zero. I mean, I don't know a single Democratic politician who supports anti-fascists or that sort of thing. And likewise, I didn't know any anti-fascists who actually supported Democrats. One of the sort of unintentionally, it would be sort of hilarious if it wasn't such a serious thing. But one of the reasons that their plan failed on January 6th is that the Proud Boys and the Patriot Prayer folk, or all of the Oath Keepers and those folks had built this idea of Antifa up in their brains as being this singular force that was going to be out there every time that they marched. And they assumed that they were going to be battling Antifa on the steps of the Congress, right? But Antifa didn't care about Joe Biden. They didn't care about, you know, um, there was nothing drawing anti-fascists to the January 6th rally other than that there were going to be a bunch of fascists there. My experience with anti-fascists, and I had some dealings with them before 2016, and every time that I encountered them, they were out responding to the presence of actual neo-Nazi fascists.
Hmm.
And they would do that. They showed up to make very loud and clear and sometimes violent demonstrations against the presence of these actual fascists, right? And that's why they call themselves anti-fascists. And what happened is that Fox News and the Republican right got a hold of this whole image of anti-fascists as a sort of existential threat to America, and built them up as this huge violent force spreading all across America. Thank you, Andy Ngo, for lying your teeth through your teeth about everybody that enjoyed this movement. Because if in fact anti-fascism was a massive movement, it might be an existential threat to the country, but it wasn't. Like I say, it's a tiny movement. Um, had only a few people uh, that I ever met that were actually involved in it, and did not really, I mean, there was some violence, but for the 90% of the violence that I saw in the streets was instigated by the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. They were the ones out there being violent, and the anti-fascists were the ones more or less trying to provide sort of a defensive violence. And that was certainly the dynamic that I watched playing out. And I mean, I got attacked a couple times by these. I got whacked. Certainly, unfortunate set of circumstances on Trump's inauguration night in 2017. I got whacked a couple times by anti-fascists. And but they were, because they didn't know who I was, and I was out there with a camera. So and my own view of them is that they are can be kind of self-righteous idiots, who don't understand how freedom of speech works and how free press works. But at the same time, considering the behavior of the rest of the press over the following 4 years, I also came to understood that maybe they had a point. So I
Yeah.
learned how to deal with them, let anybody know that in street situation, what I was doing, why I was there. I was careful not to put them in position where they could get harmed by my work, which was mainly why the reason that they were whacking me. But anyway, yeah, I don't have. I'm not an anti-fascist fan by any means, but I also keep this all in perspective, and it was very clear to me who the real threat was out there, who the real violent ones were. There wasn't any question about that. It was these guys on the right who were coming in by busloads, usually to liberal urban areas like Portland and Seattle. And they're all these guys from rural areas and ex-urban areas who are all right-wing thugs, and they just wanted a chance to beat up some liberals. That's what they're all about.
Yeah.
That was why they did it. And so, yeah, when they showed up, one of their plans on January 6th was, what they were really anticipating was that there would be anti-fascists, black-clad anti-fascists all over the steps of the Capitol for them to do battle with. And instead, it turned out that the only people for them to do battle with were the Capitol Police. And so that's who they wound up attacking. And Trump's plan, and we know this because he talked about it quite a bit, was to invoke the Insurrection Act on January 6th. That would then bring in the military and shut everything down. And that would give him the opportunity to then delay things through Congress until he could get his way,
Mm.
basically talk Congress into throwing the election back to state legislatures, which would then empower Trump to remain in office. And the only reason it didn't happen was that there were no anti-fascists out there that day. They didn't show. Their planned battle with the anti-fascists never took place because they didn't materialize, because it was all a fantasy in their brains in the first place. They had built Antifa up into this huge existential threat that was going to be there everywhere they went. And and I've got video of them walking around marching before they attacked the Capitol. The Proud Boys, uh, uh, Ethan Nordine and Joe Biggs were out there leading these guys yelling, first they would chant, fuck Antifa, right, as they're marching around the streets of Washington. And then after a while, being frustrated, they just started chanting, where's Antifa? Because they were going, where are you guys? We want to do battle with you. And they were very frustrated by the fact that anti-fascists weren't out there. Because that's who they were used to fighting. And that's who they expected to fight. And so I think they were very thrown off by actually the fact that they wound up having to attack police because they saw the police as being on their side. And it's one of the things that we've got a lot of video of them talking to the police officers that they were attacking on the Capitol steps that day, calling them traitors and saying, "You're supposed to be on our side." Blah 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 blah.
Mm-hmm.
That was part of their mindset.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that.
Yeah.
I wanted to just ask one last question. Is there any advice you could share for people who are concerned by what they're seeing with the rise of the far right, both politically and even in their own homes? And are there any sort of practical things within the bounds of the law that can sort of be done to kind of counter this?
Well, a lot of our guardrails are gone, including law enforcement guardrail, which has traditionally been our guardrail against right-wing extremists, right-wing domestic terrorists. Our guardrail's always been law enforcement, and let's just say that guardrail is very weak right now. Certainly, I had no problem with my local law enforcement or even state law enforcement because I'm in a very blue state, right? But not all of them. And I think so. I think a lot of our guardrails uh, in dealing with the very considerable likelihood that there will be violence over the next 4 years directed at people who are in vulnerable situations uh, is I think it's not anything we can just take too lightly or ignore and pretend and hope it goes away, because I think we need to do some preparations. Um, I think the best thing that a lot of us can do, and what I'm doing, is acting locally, linking up arms with people that I know in my own community and forming community defense. So we're prepared. So we're preparing to be able to respond to situations where if any of these violent actors show up in our communities and try to form acts of violence, that we have the ability to respond with or without law enforcement, and where we had the ability to defend ourselves with or without law enforcement. And I think that is certainly, I think that's, it's obviously legal to make those kinds of preparations. And I think in this case, it would be astute.
Indeed. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up today?
Mostly, I just hope that people understand that this isn't a lot of fantasy, that this is actually happening, that this is very much a real threat. I've been dealing for the last 10 years. One of my favorite memes that I've got on my desktop is the one that says, "The road to fascism is lined with people telling you to stop overreacting." Right?
Oh yeah, I've seen that one. Yeah.
I've been told to stop overreacting for the last 20 years, right? Because I've been warning about this problem for at least 20 years. And so, yeah, my Cassandra complex has gone completely off the deep end.
Yeah.
But, I just hope that people understand that this is real, that the people who are concerned about it are not overreacting. I do think that, uh, so, I did mention immigrants as, by the way, as people likely to be targeted. I also think the LGBTQ community is very likely to be targeted, particularly transgender people. I think that these guys have a giant bug up their butts about transgenderism, and they want to do these people harm. And, especially when we start having pride events in the summer, um, and where we have drag queens performing and that sort of thing. We've certainly already seen these guys show up and do threatening behavior. We saw one of them show up at a queer bar in Colorado Springs, uh, 2 years ago and shoot the place up and killed 5
Mm,
people and wounded 28, you know, so, um, so we know that they can and will act out in violent ways, and, I think pretending the problem away, probably and wishing that it would just be, of course, I hear all the time, "Oh, if you just didn't pay attention to them, it wouldn't be a problem. They would just go away." And it's like,
if
yeah,
only.
that has never worked. It has never worked. And I have some personal experience about that. So,
Mm,
dating back to the '70s when the newspaper I worked on, we decided when we had the Aryan nations move in down the road from us, we decided we were just gonna ignore them. We'll just, if we don't pay attention to them, they will just go away. And within the next 2 years, 3 years, we were just awash in all these crimes, bank robberies, hate crimes, all this violence, and it finally culminated in the rampage of the Order, which, the was the neo-Nazi gang that robbed 24 banks and assassinated a radio talk show host, and they
yes, yeah.
there's a recent movie about it starring,
Oh, yeah, there is a new film about it. 'Cause I was thinking of the old one that was directed or written by Oliver Stone. Was it directed by Oliver Stone as well? It's
yeah.
called Talk Radio. That's a really good film.
Yeah, and there was also a film called Betrayed, that
Mm,
had Tom Berenger in it, but the most recent one has, Nicholas Hoult playing, the role of Bob Matthews, who was a guy I
mm,
knew, and, the leader of the Order. And yeah, and, there was, at any rate, I learned early on that if you try to pretend them away, they actually find that's a sign of encouragement to them
mm,
because they see silence as a form of tacit approval, and they see non-response by the community as actual approval by the community. They believe, it's this conventionalism. They believe that they represent the real America, and that that really the when they act, that they're doing it on behalf of the community, and the community secretly approves of them. So
mm, mm.
that's, yeah, staying silent and ignoring them, not only doesn't work, it has the exact opposite effect. It actually encourages them. So,
Yeah, yeah. Well, wise words there. Thank you very much. Where can listeners find out more about you and your work, David?
well, I'm running a Substack site these days. It's called the Spy Hop.
Oh, that's good. That's a good name.
It's under my name, David.Neiwert or David Neiwert at Substack, and yeah, and I am posting these days on Blue Sky. I've abandoned Twitter,
Me
and
too.
so I post quite regularly on Blue Sky. So you can follow me in either of those places.
Fantastic. And we'll put links in our show notes there. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been really great to catch up with you. It's a shame it's under such circumstances. Maybe, hopefully in time we can maybe catch up in less dire circumstances.
Yeah, who knows? I'd love to get out, take a vacation to Europe one of these days soon.
Oh,
So
yeah.
if I do,
Come to London.
I'll give you. Yeah, I love London, so I'd be glad to drop by.
Good.
Anyway, yeah, it's right. My first appearance with you was in the studio there in
It
London, as I
was. It
recall.
was. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was. We were
So
talking about your book, Alt America.
yeah,
And, sadly, that interview, which was years ago, feels very prophetic to what's going on now. So it's,
yeah, yeah. Well, like I say, Cassandra's got nothing on me, man. The seer who was doomed to be, not believed, right? That was
yeah,
that
well,
was Cassan that was Cassandra's curse.
Yes,
So.
yes, indeed, yes. But we'll always be welcome on here, and and we definitely take you seriously on this show. So thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Chris.
That's all right. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. This is Secrets and Spies.